James Mitchell stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform perfectly pressed and his bearskin hat sitting precisely on his head. The tourists loved taking pictures with the guards, thinking they were just ceremonial figures who stood still all day. What they didn't know was that James had spent the last 8 years as one of the most deadly snipers in the Special Air Service. The morning sun reflected off his polished boots as he maintained his stoic expression. A group of American tourists gathered nearby, whispering about how the guards never moved or spoke. James had heard it all before. Some people even tried to make him laugh or flinch, but his military training kept him focused. After his shift ended, James changed into civilian clothes and headed to the local shooting range where he went twice a week to keep his skills sharp. The range was popular with police officers, military personnel, and shooting enthusiasts from around London. James always kept quiet about his SAS background, preferring to blend in as just another former soldier. As he walked into the range, he noticed a group of younger men who were regulars there. They were decent shots but loved to boast about their abilities. James had watched them compete against each other for months, always trying to prove who was the better marksman. Today they seemed particularly animated about something. "Did you hear about the new guy?" one of them said loudly. "Claims he's a royal guard. Probably thinks he's special because he stands around a palace all day." The others laughed, not realizing that James was the person they were talking about. James collected his equipment and moved to his usual lane. He preferred the longer distances, typically shooting at targets 300 to 500 meters away. The range had an outdoor section that allowed for these longer shots, which most casual shooters avoided. James methodically set up his rifle, a precision instrument he had purchased with his own money. The group of men continued their conversation, growing louder as they discussed various military units. One claimed his brother was in the Royal Marines. Another said his cousin was a paratrooper. They spoke with the confidence of people who had heard stories but never experienced combat themselves. "I bet that Royal Guard couldn't hit the broadside of a barn," one of them joked. "Those ceremonial soldiers are just for show. Real military training is completely different." James remained focused on his preparations. Checking his scope and adjusting his position, the rangemaster, an older man named Bill who had served in the army decades earlier, noticed the conversation. He knew James was more than he appeared to be, having observed his shooting skills over the months. Bill had seen many soldiers come through the range, but James was different. His technique, his calm demeanor, and his incredible accuracy suggested extensive training far beyond what most people possessed. As James loaded his first round, he could feel the eyes of the other shooters on him. Word had somehow spread that he was one of the Royal Guards, and people were curious to see how he would perform. Some expected him to be all show and no substance, while others wondered if the Royal Guards received more training than people assumed. The shooting range fell quieter as James took his position. He controlled his breathing, steadied his aim, and fired his first shot at a target 400 meters away. The electronic scoring system immediately displayed the result on the monitor, visible to everyone in the range. The shot had hit dead center, scoring a perfect 10. The group of men who had been talking stopped their conversation. One perfect shot could be luck, they reasoned. James continued his routine, firing shot after shot with mechanical precision. Each round found its mark exactly where he intended, creating a tight grouping that impressed even the experienced shooters present. Bill watched with a slight smile, knowing that James was just getting warmed up. The Royal Guard's reputation at the range was about to change dramatically, though James himself seemed completely unaware of the attention he was drawing. He was simply doing what came naturally to him after years of intensive training in some of the world's most challenging conditions. The whispers around the shooting range grew louder as James continued his practice session. What had started as casual mockery from the group of regulars was quickly turning into bewildered silence. Shot after shot, James placed his rounds exactly where he intended, creating patterns on the target that seemed almost impossible for someone they assumed was just a ceremonial guard. Marcus, the most vocal of the group, decided he couldn't let this continue without comment. He was known at the range for his competitive nature and his inability to back down from a challenge. Walking over to James's lane, he cleared his throat loudly to get attention. "Nice shooting," Marcus said with a tone that suggested anything but admiration, "though I suppose standing still all day gives you plenty of time to practice breathing control." His friends chuckled behind him, but their laughter sounded forced now that they had witnessed James's accuracy. James simply nodded politely and continued preparing for his next series of shots. He had learned long ago that responding to provocations was rarely worth the effort. His focus remained on the distant target, where he planned to demonstrate some of the more advanced techniques he had mastered during his SAS training. "Tell you what," Marcus continued, emboldened by what he interpreted as James's lack of response. "How about we make this interesting? A little competition between us. I'll show you how real marksmen shoot." He gestured toward his own setup, which included an expensive rifle with multiple modifications and accessories. The other shooters at the range began to take notice of the brewing confrontation. Some moved closer to get a better view, while others pretended to focus on their own shooting while keeping one ear on the conversation. Bill, the range master, positioned himself where he could see both lanes clearly. James finally looked up from his rifle and made eye contact with Marcus. "What kind of competition did you have in mind?" he asked quietly. His voice carried no aggression or defensiveness, just simple curiosity about what Marcus was proposing. "Distance shooting," Marcus replied quickly, having clearly thought about this. 5 shots each at 500 meters. Highest score wins. Loser buys drinks for everyone here. The challenge was designed to be public and humiliating for whoever lost. Exactly the kind of situation Marcus thrived in. James considered the proposal for a moment. He rarely engaged in competitions, preferring to keep his abilities private. However, something about Marcus's attitude reminded him of the arrogant recruits he had occasionally encountered during his military service. Sometimes a demonstration was the most effective form of education. 500 meters, James repeated, looking toward the distant targets. "All right, but let's make it more interesting. 10 shots each, and we include wind compensation. The weather station shows variable winds today." He pointed to the small weather monitoring device that displayed current conditions. Marcus's confidence wavered slightly. Wind compensation at 500 meters was significantly more challenging than straight-line shooting. However, he had committed himself publicly and couldn't back down now. "Fine," he agreed. 10 shots with wind compensation. The two men moved to adjacent lanes with clear sight lines to the 500-meter targets. Bill announced the competition to the other shooters who gathered around to watch. Some placed informal bets on the outcome, though most seemed to favor Marcus based on his reputation and expensive equipment. James spent several minutes studying the wind conditions, watching how the grass moved at various distances, and noting the direction of smoke from a small building beyond the range. This kind of environmental analysis had kept him alive during countless operations, where a single missed shot could mean disaster for his entire team. Marcus, meanwhile, was adjusting his scope and making calculations on a small notepad. His approach was more technical and equipment-dependent, relying on ballistic computers and range-finding devices to provide precise measurements. There was nothing wrong with this method, but it suggested a different kind of training and experience. As they prepared to begin, James felt the familiar calm that always preceded his most challenging shots. The noise around him seemed to fade away, leaving only the essential elements: the target, the wind, his breathing, and the rifle that had become an extension of his body through years of intensive practice. The competition was about to reveal just how much difference existed between recreational shooting and the kind of training that created elite military snipers. Marcus was skilled, but he was about to face someone whose life had once depended on making impossible shots under the worst possible conditions. The tension at the shooting range was thick as both men prepared for their competition. Marcus went first, confident in his expensive equipment and years of recreational shooting experience. He took his time, adjusting his scope multiple times and consulting his ballistic calculator before each shot. His first shot scored an 8, hitting the outer ring of the target's scoring zone. Not bad for 500 meters with wind, but not the dominating performance he had hoped to display. The small crowd murmured appreciatively, though some seemed surprised it wasn't better given his confident attitude. Marcus continued through his 10 shots, maintaining steady performance. His scores ranged from 7 to 9, with most hitting the 8 ring. His final total was 83 points out of a possible 100. The gathered shooters applauded politely, recognizing it as solid shooting under challenging conditions. "Not bad for a warm-up," Marcus announced loudly. though sweat on his forehead suggested he had been trying much harder than he wanted to admit. "Let's see what our ceremonial friend can do." He stepped back with exaggerated confidence, but his eyes betrayed some nervousness about what might happen next. James approached his firing position with the same methodical precision he had used for hundreds of operational shots. He didn't consult any electronic devices or make complex calculations. Instead, he simply observed the environment, feeling the wind on his face and watching how it affected the grass and trees at various distances. His first shot rang out, and the electronic scoring system immediately displayed the result. A perfect 10, dead center in the bullseye. The crowd stirred with interest, but James showed no reaction. He simply cycled his bolt and prepared for the next shot as if hitting perfect scores at 500 meters was routine. The second shot, another 10. Then a third. By his fourth consecutive perfect shot, the entire range had gone silent except for the sound of James's rifle and the electronic scoring announcements. Even Marcus had stopped trying to appear casual and was staring openly at the target display. James continued with mechanical precision, his breathing controlled and his movements economical. Each shot followed the same pattern: observe, aim, breathe, squeeze, score. 10 after 10 appeared on the display, creating a perfect grouping that would have been impressive at 100 meters, let alone 500. Bill, the rangemaster, had never seen anything like it. In 30 years of running shooting ranges, he had witnessed many skilled marksmen. But this level of consistency under these conditions was extraordinary. He began to understand that James was operating on a completely different level than anyone else present. As James fired his 8th shot, another perfect 10, Marcus realized he was witnessing something far beyond recreational shooting. This wasn't luck or beginner's fortune. This was the kind of shooting that came from training most people couldn't imagine, and experience most people would never survive. The 9th shot hit exactly where James intended, maintaining the impossibly tight grouping he had established. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were studying every movement James made, trying to understand how someone could shoot with such incredible precision. James prepared for his final shot, taking the same careful approach he had used for the previous 9. The wind had shifted slightly and he adjusted his aim accordingly, without any visible equipment or calculations. His decade of experience told him exactly how the bullet would behave in the current conditions. The 10th shot completed a perfect score, 100 points out of 100 possible. 10 consecutive bullseyes at 500 meters with variable wind conditions. The electronic system displayed not just the score but also the grouping size. All 10 shots could be covered by a coin. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood with his mouth slightly open. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The other shooters looked between James and the target display, trying to process what they had just witnessed. James calmly unloaded his rifle and began packing his equipment, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. He had accomplished exactly what his training had prepared him to do, but for everyone else present, they had just seen something that challenged their understanding of what was humanly possible. The competition was over, but the questions were just beginning. Who was this quiet man they had assumed was just a ceremonial guard? How had he developed skills that seemed to belong in a different category entirely from anything they had ever witnessed? And most importantly, what other capabilities might he possess that they couldn't even imagine? The stunned silence at the shooting range finally broke when Bill, the rangemaster, began to clap slowly. His applause was followed by the other shooters, though their clapping sounded more like amazement than celebration. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the perfect score display as if willing it to change. "Incredible shooting," Bill said, approaching James as he finished packing his equipment. "In 30 years I've never seen anything like that. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" His question voiced what everyone present was thinking. James simply smiled and shouldered his rifle case. "Military training," he replied quietly. "You pick things up over the years." His understated response only deepened the mystery surrounding his abilities. Marcus finally found his voice, though it lacked his earlier swagger. "Military training?" he repeated. "But you're a royal guard. That's just ceremonial duty, right? Standing around palaces and tourist attractions?" His confusion was genuine, reflecting the common misconception about what royal guards actually were. "The royal guards are selected from active military units," James explained patiently. We don't stop being soldiers just because we put on a different uniform. He started walking toward the exit, clearly intending to leave without making a bigger deal of what had just happened. But the other shooters weren't ready to let him go. Questions came from multiple directions. What unit were you with? How long have you been shooting? Have you been in combat? James answered politely but vaguely, maintaining the discretion that had been drilled into him during his special forces training. Sarah, one of the few women who regularly used the range, had been watching the entire competition with growing interest. Unlike the others, she wasn't focused on the shooting itself, but on James's behavior and technique. Something about his movements and his calm demeanor reminded her of the special operations personnel she had worked with during her time as a military journalist. That wasn't just military training, Sarah said quietly to Bill as James continued fielding questions from the group. I've covered special forces operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. That level of shooting ability and that kind of composure under pressure comes from very specific, very elite training. Bill nodded thoughtfully. He had suspected there was more to James than met the eye. But the perfect shooting demonstration had confirmed that this was someone with extraordinary qualifications. Special forces? He asked. Has to be, Sarah replied. Probably SAS or SBS based on his age and the fact that he's now with the Royal Guards. Those units often provide personnel for royal protection duties when they transition out of active operations. Meanwhile, Marcus was struggling to process his complete defeat. He had built his reputation at the range on being one of the better shooters, and he had never been beaten so decisively. The perfect score seemed impossible, yet he had witnessed it firsthand. Look, Marcus said, approaching James with less hostility than before. That was amazing shooting. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. But I have to ask, if you can shoot like that, what are you doing standing guard at a palace? Shouldn't you be doing something more important? James paused, considering how to respond. The question touched on something he thought about regularly, the transition from active special operations to his current role. Every job has its importance, he said finally. Protecting people is always worthwhile, whether it's tourists at a palace or soldiers in a combat zone. The answer revealed more about James's character than any shooting demonstration could. It showed a man who understood duty and service in ways that went beyond personal glory or recognition. The other shooters began to see him differently, not just as an incredibly skilled marksman, but as someone whose motivations were fundamentally different from their own. As the group began to disperse, several people approached James individually. Some wanted shooting advice, others were simply curious about his background. A few offered to buy him drinks, remembering Marcus's original bet about the loser buying for everyone. James declined most of the offers politely, maintaining the low profile that had served him well throughout his military career. But he did agree to return the following week, and several of the regulars made plans to be there as well. The quiet Royal Guard had unknowingly become the most interesting person at the shooting range. As James finally left the building, Sarah approached Bill one more time. You know, she said, I think we just witnessed something pretty rare. That man isn't just a good shot. He's someone who's been trained to kill at distances most people can't even see clearly, and now he spends his days protecting tourists and standing ceremonial guard. There's probably a story there worth knowing. The following week, the shooting range was busier than Bill had seen it in months. Word had spread about the mysterious Royal Guard who had shot a perfect score at 500 meters, and several new faces had appeared hoping to witness another demonstration. Marcus arrived early, having spent the week researching military shooting techniques and practicing obsessively. James noticed the increased attention as soon as he walked through the door. More people than usual looked up when he entered, and conversation seemed to pause as he passed. He had hoped his performance the previous week would be forgotten, but clearly that wasn't going to happen. Sarah was there again, this time with a small recording device that she kept discreetly out of sight. Her journalistic instincts told her there was a bigger story here, and she wanted to be prepared if James revealed more about his background. She had spent the week making inquiries through her military contacts, but information about Special Forces personnel was closely guarded. Welcome back, Bill greeted James warmly. I think you've attracted some new admirers. He gestured toward the larger-than-usual crowd, many of whom were clearly hoping to see another impressive shooting display. James nodded politely but seemed less comfortable with the attention than he had been the week before. He collected his equipment and moved toward his preferred lane, hoping to practice quietly without creating another spectacle. However, it quickly became apparent that several people were positioning themselves to watch whatever he did. Marcus approached with noticeably more respect than he had shown previously. "James," he said, "I wanted to apologize for last week. I was out of line with some of my comments. That shooting you did was absolutely incredible, and I'd be honored if you could give me some pointers." The change in Marcus's attitude was dramatic. The arrogant competitor had been replaced by someone genuinely humbled by what he had witnessed. James appreciated the apology and agreed to share some basic techniques, though he was careful not to reveal any methods that might be classified or sensitive. As James began his practice session, he demonstrated various shooting positions and breathing techniques. His instruction was clear and patient, showing the same attention to detail that had made him an effective teacher during his SAS service. Several other shooters gathered around to listen, creating an impromptu masterclass. "The key is consistency," James explained as he demonstrated his shooting stance. "Equipment can help, but technique is everything. You need to do exactly the same thing every time, so your body becomes a stable platform for the rifle." He showed how to achieve proper bone support and muscle relaxation. What impressed the observers most was how James could switch between different shooting scenarios effortlessly. He demonstrated precision shooting at long range, rapid engagement at shorter distances, and shooting from unconventional positions. Each technique showed mastery that came from extensive training and real-world application. During a break between demonstrations, Sarah finally approached James directly. "I'm a journalist," she said honestly. "I've covered military operations overseas, and I recognize special operations training when I see it. Would you be willing to talk about your background?" James studied her carefully before responding. "There's not much I can say about previous assignments," he replied diplomatically. "But I can tell you that the Royal Guards take their responsibilities very seriously. We're not just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms." "SAS?" Sarah asked quietly, direct enough that only James could hear the question. James's expression didn't change, but his slight pause before saying, "No comment," told Sarah everything she needed to know. She had her confirmation, though she knew he would never admit it publicly while still serving in any capacity. The afternoon continued with James providing instruction and answering general questions about military shooting techniques. He was careful to share only information that was publicly available, but even basic Special Forces methods were far beyond what most civilian shooters had ever encountered. As the session wound down, one of the newer shooters asked a question that made everyone pause. "If you don't mind me asking, why did you leave active military service for guard duty? Seems like someone with your skills would be in high demand for more active roles." James was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. "Sometimes you reach a point where you've done enough," he said finally. "Where you want to serve in a different way, maybe protect people without having to hurt anyone. The Royal Guards give me that opportunity." The answer revealed a depth of experience and perhaps some weariness that hadn't been apparent before. It suggested someone who had seen enough combat to appreciate the value of peaceful service. Someone who had transitioned from taking lives to protecting them. As people began to pack up their equipment, Marcus made one final approach to James. "Would you consider coming back next week? Maybe we could set up some group instruction. I think everyone here would benefit from learning from someone with your experience." James agreed, though he requested that they keep the sessions low-key. He didn't want to become a spectacle or attract the kind of attention that might compromise his current duties. The shooting range had become an unexpected place where he could share his knowledge, while maintaining the discretion his position required. 3 weeks later, James had become an unofficial instructor at the shooting range. His Tuesday evening sessions drew a regular group of students who were eager to learn from someone with obvious expertise. The dynamic had completely shifted from the initial mockery to genuine respect and admiration. Sarah had been attending regularly, not just for the shooting instruction, but because she sensed there were deeper stories waiting to be told. During one session, she noticed James subtly scan the range's entrances whenever new people arrived, and how he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to multiple exits. These were habits ingrained by years of operating in hostile environments. The breakthrough came when a new student arrived who immediately changed James's demeanor. The man was older, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He introduced himself simply as Colonel Peterson, retired, but something about his presence made James noticeably more formal. "Sergeant Mitchell," the colonel said quietly, approaching James after the group session had ended. The use of James's military rank confirmed what Sarah had suspected about his background. "I heard about your shooting demonstrations. Quite impressive from what I'm told." James stood straighter, his casual instructor persona replaced by military bearing. "Sir," he acknowledged. "Didn't expect to see anyone from the regiment here." The word regiment was spoken quietly, but Sarah caught it. In British military parlance, the regiment typically referred to the SAS. "I'm not here officially," Colonel Peterson clarified. "But word travels in our community. Perfect scores at 500 meters tend to be noticed, especially when they're achieved by someone who's supposed to be in ceremonial duties." His tone suggested this wasn't entirely a social visit. The conversation moved to a private area of the range, but Sarah could see the serious nature of their discussion. James listened more than he spoke, occasionally nodding or asking brief questions. Whatever they were discussing, it was clearly important and potentially sensitive. Marcus and the other regular students watched the interaction with curiosity. They had grown accustomed to James being the most skilled person present, but the arrival of someone who could command his immediate respect suggested layers to this story they hadn't imagined. After 20 minutes, Colonel Peterson shook James's hand and departed without speaking to anyone else. James returned to the group, but his demeanor remained more serious than usual. When asked about the visitor, he simply said it was regimental business and changed the subject to shooting techniques. Later, as the range was closing, Sarah approached James one final time. "I know you can't talk about classified operations," she said carefully, "but I think there's a story here about transition and service that people should understand. The public sees Royal Guards as tourist attractions, but you've shown there's much more to it." James considered her words thoughtfully. "What kind of story are you thinking about?" he asked. "Something about the different ways people serve their country," Sarah replied, "about how someone can go from high-level military operations to protecting tourists and ceremonial duties, and how both roles are important. Nothing that would compromise security or reveal classified information." For the first time since she had known him, James seemed genuinely interested in the possibility of sharing his story. "I'd have to get approval," he said slowly, "and it would have to be done carefully. But maybe it would help people understand that service comes in many forms." The conversation was interrupted by Bill, who approached with concern evident on his face. "James, I hate to bring this up, but I've had some inquiries about you this week. People asking questions about your background and when you come here. Nothing threatening, but it made me uncomfortable." James's expression hardened immediately. His years of special operations training had taught him to take any unusual interest in his activities seriously. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "Professional questions," Bill replied. "People who knew military terminology and seemed to know more about you than they should. I didn't give them any information, but I thought you should know." The revelation cast a shadow over what had been a pleasant evening. James realized that his demonstrations at the range might have attracted more attention than he had intended. In his current role, maintaining a low profile was important not just for his own security, but for the safety of those he was responsible for protecting. "I think I need to take a break from coming here," James said reluctantly, "at least until I can figure out who's asking questions and why." The decision clearly disappointed him, as he had come to enjoy the teaching and the camaraderie of the regular students. Marcus spoke for the group when he said, "We understand, but we hope it's temporary. You've taught us more in a few weeks than we learned in years of shooting on our own." The sentiment was echoed by the others, who had come to appreciate not just James's skills but his patient instruction and quiet professionalism. As James gathered his equipment for what might be the last time in a while, Sarah made a decision. "If you do decide to tell your story," she said, "I promise it will be done with the respect it deserves. There are people who need to understand that heroes don't always look like what they expect." 6 months later, Sarah's carefully crafted article appeared in a respected military magazine, titled "The Quiet Guardians." When elite soldiers become palace protectors, it told the story of James Mitchell without revealing any classified information or compromising his security. The article explained How many Royal Guards were selected from Britain's most elite military units, bringing years of combat experience and specialized training to what the public assumed were purely ceremonial roles? It described the rigorous selection process and ongoing training that Royal Guards underwent, dispelling the myth that they were simply tourist attractions. James had eventually agreed to participate in the story after receiving approval from his superiors. The interview was conducted under strict conditions, with certain topics completely off limits and all quotes reviewed before publication. The resulting piece was respectful and informative, without sensationalizing his background. The article's impact was immediate and positive. Military families appreciated seeing recognition for the diverse ways soldiers served their country. Tourism officials noted increased respect from visitors who better understood the qualifications of the guards they encountered. Most importantly, it helped bridge the gap between public perception and reality. At the shooting range, Bill had framed a copy of the article and hung it near the entrance. The piece mentioned the range as a place where military personnel continued to maintain their skills, bringing Bill a steady stream of new customers who wanted to train where the SAS sniper had practiced. Marcus had become something of a local celebrity himself, telling anyone who would listen about the time he challenged a Special Forces veteran to a shooting competition. His story grew more elaborate with each telling, though he always emphasized James's incredible skill and professionalism. James eventually returned to the range, though less frequently and with more security precautions. The inquiries about his activities had been traced to a foreign intelligence service conducting routine surveillance of British military personnel. Nothing threatening, but enough to require increased vigilance. The regular students welcomed him back enthusiastically, and the Tuesday evening sessions resumed with a new appreciation for what they were learning. James continued to be careful about what he taught, but the students understood they were receiving instruction from someone with extraordinary qualifications. Colonel Peterson made one more appearance, this time to officially commend James for his discretion and professionalism in handling the media attention. The conversation remained private, but James emerged with a slight smile that suggested positive feedback from his former regiment. Sarah went on to write a series of articles about military transition and the various ways service members continued to serve after leaving active duty. James's story became the foundation for a broader examination of how society could better support and understand veterans' contributions. The shooting range had become a different place, with a culture of respect and serious training that attracted high-quality students. Bill often reflected on how one perfect shooting demonstration had transformed not just the range's reputation, but the entire community's understanding of what excellence looked like. Years later, tourists at Buckingham Palace still had no idea that the silent guard in the red uniform might be someone with the skills to hit a target accurately from distances they couldn't even see clearly. But occasionally, a visitor who had read Sarah's article would look at the guards with new respect, understanding that they were in the presence of professionals whose qualifications went far beyond what was visible. James continued his dual life, standing ceremonial guard during the day and maintaining his skills at the range in the evenings. He had found a way to serve that honored both his past and his present, protecting people in peacetime with the same dedication he had once brought to combat operations. The story of the Royal Guard who amazed everyone at the shooting range became a legend in military circles. But more importantly, it became a reminder that service and sacrifice often wore humble uniforms and stood quiet watch in places where their true capabilities would never be fully known or appreciated. James Mitchell had shown that a hero's greatest strength sometimes lay not in demonstrating their abilities, but in using them quietly and consistently in service of others.